100 years ago, Europe would have represented the present, United States would have represented the future, and Asia would have represented the past. That was the world 100 years ago. But now in 2025, things have moved, and today the European Union represents the past, the United States of America represents the present, and Asia represents the future. Now, this obviously is a slightly provocative statement, but let me just give two pieces of data so you understand what I mean by that. When the 21st century opened in the year 2000, the combined GNP of the European Union countries was 8 times bigger than China, 8 times bigger in the year 2000. Now the EU and China are about the same size. But by 2050, EU will be half the size of China. So you can see how the century opens the year 2000, Europe is 8 times bigger. By the middle of the century, Europe is half the size of China. That's an example of a major power shift. Another country I use for comparison purposes is India. And in the case of India, I compare India with the United Kingdom because, 100 years ago, amazingly, 100,000 Englishmen could effortlessly rule over 300 million Indians. That's quite amazing. Today, if the British send 100,000 soldiers to conquer India, they'll be massacred. So the world has changed. But even the British, as recently as the year 2000, when the century opened, the British economy was 3.5, 3.6 times bigger than India. Today, India's economy is bigger than the British. And by 2050, India will be 4 times bigger than the British economy. So century opens, UK almost 4 times bigger. By the middle of the century, India is 4 times bigger than UK. But these are examples of fundamental structural shifts of power that are happening in the world. Now, the big question is, why is this happening? Why is power shifting to Asia? And I would give at least 3 reasons for this. The first is that we are returning to the normal state of the world. And the reason why I say we're returning to the normal state of the world is because China and India were the 2 largest economies of the world from the year 1 to about the year 1820. So for 1800 out of the last 2000 years, the largest economies were those of China and India. So the return of China and India, and by the way, not just China and India, other parts of Asia too, is a return to the norm. And as you know, it's much easier to return to the norm rather than to fight against the norm in terms of growth and achievements. And so that's why future historians will not be surprised to see the return of China and India. The second reason why the Asian countries are succeeding is that, as you know, I mentioned 100 years ago, Europe was running the world effectively. What's happened is that the Asian countries finally studied, learned, and absorbed the lessons from the West. So many of the reasons, one of the reasons why Asian countries are successful today is because they have learned some very valuable lessons from Western countries. So, for example, I'll give you 2 simple examples. One reason why the West could conquer the world 100 years ago was because the West had superior science and technology, right? And the superior science and technology was also deployed in military power. And that was 100 years ago. But today, it is the mastery of science and technology is shifting to Asia. And certainly in the case of China, China has invested massively in terms of R&D, in science and technology. And if you look at what they call Tier 1 peer-reviewed academic papers, the Chinese now produce more Tier 1 peer-reviewed academic papers in science and technology than even the United States does. That's an example of how the shift has happened. And in many areas, you'll find China, and whenever I say China, I'll often also mean to include other Asian states that have done well. And so among the top universities in the world, you find today clearly several Asian universities too. Then the other thing I'd mention, another big idea that Asians learned from the West was, of course, free market economics. And here it's quite amazing that even though it was the Western countries, especially the United States, that taught the world the benefits of opening up your economy, liberalizing your economy, sign free trade agreements, and then you will grow and prosper. And what is shocking today is that the Asian countries learned this lesson. And so they opened up their economies, they liberalized, and they grew very fast. And then they suddenly find that their teacher, the United States of America, is saying, no, we will not sign any free trade agreements with anybody. And that's an amazing reversal, okay? And if you believe in economic theory, if you believe that free markets is what's going to enable your economy to grow, then clearly the theory means that Asian countries will grow faster. Because the world's largest free trade agreements, including, for example, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that was initiated by the then 10 countries of ASEAN, was then joined by China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and that's how you ended up with the world's largest free trade agreement. And what's interesting is that even though the United States decided to increase tariffs on the rest of the world after President Trump took office in January this year, no Asian country has joined President Trump in increasing its tariffs on the world. They said, no, we will keep up the policies of the past. And that's why the Asian economies are growing very well. And if you have any doubt about that, let me give you one more statistic. You know, in Southeast Asia, the regional organization is ASEAN. The combined GNP of ASEAN is only 1/5 that of the European Union. The European Union is 5 times bigger. Yet in the decade 2010 to 2020, ASEAN added more to global economic growth than the entire European Union did. So that's the kind of growth you see happening in Asia. And that's that reason why I'm confident that Asia will do well, is because there has been what I call an explosion of cultural confidence in Asia. So when you travel around the world and you're looking for people, young people who are optimistic and who believe that their future will be better than that of their parents, you come to Asia and you'll encounter a lot more optimism than you would in other parts of the world, because the simple reason being that they have seen great improvements in their lives, in the course of their lives. And if you want to get a sense of how poor our beginnings were, incidentally, you can look at my memoirs, Living the Asian Century, in which I describe how when I grew up in Singapore, Singapore's per capita income was the same as Ghana. In Africa, it was about $500. And, you know, I grew up in a house without a flush toilet. I was put in a special feeding program because I was technically undernourished. I lived in a typical third world country as a child. But the same country, Singapore, today its per capita income has gone up from $500 to $90,000, higher than that of United States or United Kingdom. And that's an example of the amazing transformation that you see in Asia. But of course, in any situation, there are always risks. And certainly there are risks and challenges to Asia's growth. And I mentioned 3 major risks as examples of what could go wrong in Asia. Because in one lesson I learned in my life, nothing goes in a straight line. In life, you always have ups and downs, and there will be ups and downs in terms of Asia's growth also. Although the long-term trend line will be upwards. In terms of the risks, the number one risk, of course, is the US-China geopolitical contests. And that's what my book, Has China Won, is all about. It explains why the US-China contest will accelerate over the next 10, 20 years, because there is an iron law of geopolitics, which says that whenever the world's number one emerging power, which today, by the way, is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, the world's number one power will always push down the world's number one emerging power. And so when the United States is trying to stop China's growth, that is perfectly normal, predictable behavior of the number one great power. Of course, the big question is whether the United States can succeed. And I believe that it'll be very difficult for the United States to stop China's rise, which is why in the conclusion of my book, Has China Won, I recommend that US and China should learn to work with each other rather than to try and push each other down. And I think that would be the wiser approach to take. But in geopolitics, there's often very little wisdom, and so the struggle will continue. The second big risk that I worry about is that I keep emphasizing that the two biggest economies in Asia are those of China and India, and if they both do well and grow, that would be good for Asia. But it's also very important for China and India to get along with each other. And here the problem is that the relations between China and India, they're not bad. They are very bad. There's a lot of distrust between China and India. And things hit a rock bottom 5 years ago when there was a clash in a place called Galwan between China and India. Here, the only piece of good news is that in the last 6 months, there has been some improvement in China-India relations. And if China-India relations stabilize, then the risk of problems within China and India slowing down Asian growth will diminish. The third risk that I see is, of course, the danger of deglobalization. The reason why that is a risk is because most Asian countries have grown by increasing their exports to the rest of the world. And that was a model that worked well because for a long time, it was the West, especially United States and Europe, that defended open markets and free borders and so on and so forth. But given the political backlash against globalization in the West, there's a danger that there could be deglobalization. But here too, I think this risk is manageable because there's now enough momentum within Asia for growth, and Asia is now producing its own middle-class population. And if you want to get a sense of how big the Asian middle-class population is now, let me give you another important statistic. The total population of, and these are the three major growth poles, China, India, and ASEAN. China has got 1.4 billion people, India has got 1.4 billion people, ASEAN has got almost 700 million people. That makes a total of 3.5 billion people, or 40% of the world's population. Now, among these 3.5 billion people, in the year 2000, there were only 150 million people enjoying middle-class living standards. Only 150 million out of 3.5 billion. But by 2020, that number of the middle-class population had exploded 10 times to 1.5 billion. So an increase of 10 times over 20 years. And by 2030, the number could hit 2.5 to 3 billion people. So that's an indication of how fast the middle class has grown. And quite naturally, the demand for products and so on and so forth will also grow in this region. And so there could be a virtuous circle happening in Asia. So let me conclude by talking about why, despite all the risks and challenges, I feel optimistic for Asia. and especially for China. And in the case of China, I would say that I have a simple 3M theory as to why China is likely to succeed rather than fail in its development. And the first M is motivation. Here, there's a phrase that I think all of you should be familiar with. It's called the century of humiliation. And from the Chinese point of view, the century of humiliation happened from the Opium War of 1842 to the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. And that those 100 years were among the worst 100 years in Chinese history, where they were trampled by many great powers, including the Western great powers, including Japan. And so the Chinese have told themselves, never again will we allow a century of humiliation. And that motivation gives the Chinese leaders and Chinese people a drive that very few other societies have. The second M is momentum. And, the Chinese have invested very wisely in the industries of the future. So another shocking statistic is that in the year 2000, China's share of global manufacturing was only 5%. Now it's about 30%, but it could hit 45%. So this is amazing how China has grown its manufacturing capabilities. So I was visiting China over the last 2 weeks, and I visited many of their advanced factories. And clearly today, China's technology and China's factories are among the best in the world in many of the fields. And so the momentum in that sector will also keep them going. And the last M is meritocracy. And by meritocracy, I mean the fact that the Chinese leadership is among the one that is chosen in the most meritocratic fashion. And you don't get to high office just because your cousin or your uncle or your brother holds office. You get to high office on the basis of your merit and qualification. So what this means is that the quality of mind of senior Chinese policymakers are among the best in the world. And as you know, any organization that is able to recruit the best to run it is the one that is going to succeed. So that's why I believe that Chinese growth is not peaking anytime soon. It's going to continue to grow over the next 10, 20 years. Asia, by the way, is a vast region. It has about 55 to 60% of the world is Asian. So clearly in such a large region, you have many problem countries also. Not all Asian countries are success stories, and that's why I said life doesn't go in a straight line. And in any region, you will have countries that are problem countries, and Myanmar is a problem country. And there are some what they call impossible problems, and you can't solve them immediately. So Myanmar, maybe 10 to 20 years from now, you might be able to find a solution. But right now, it's a deeply divided country, and I don't see any early solution to Myanmar. But Myanmar is not going to stop the growth of Southeast Asia. Myanmar is not going to slow down the growth of Asia at all. It'd be a problem country in our neighborhood. And it's a manageable problem country because it doesn't export its problems to other countries. Now, in the case of Singapore, despite its high per capita income, is still continuing to grow and do very well. This year, it might still grow at 3 to 4%. Because in the Singapore economy is one of the most well-balanced economies in the world. We don't just rest on any one pillar. So we have a strong manufacturing pillar, 20 to 25% of our GNP. We have a very strong logistics pillar. And that's why we have one of the world's best ports and one of the world's best airports. So we are a major logistics hub. We are a major financial center. And we have a major center for tourism. And we have a massive number of tourists coming for a small country. So there are many, many pillars of Singapore's growth. And so most people If you look at the people investing in Singapore, there's still lots of people coming to invest in Singapore. And the fact that they're doing so is a vote of confidence in Singapore's future. Well, I mean, South Korea and Japan, as you know, were among the earliest Asian countries to develop. And they developed for the reasons that I mentioned, that they also learned from the West. And, in the case of the Japanese, I always say that all of Asia should send a thank you note to Japan, because Japan was the first Asian country to develop. In fact, it developed way long time ago in the 1860s, after the Meiji Restoration. And what did the Meiji reformers do? They sent delegations around the world to learn from the rest of the world how to develop. So it was Japan's development actually that inspired the other Asian countries to develop. They were the early developers. But of course, the problem that South Korea and Japan face now, they still have by the way, they have very strong and powerful economies. Okay, they're not poor, but the prospects of South Korea and Japan growing fast is not very high nowadays. They have many challenges on their front, but they're still doing very, very well, and contribute in many ways to Asia's economic growth, partly in the way that they invest across Asia. So South Korean and Japanese companies are still investing heavily all across Asia. So I'm optimistic that South Korea and Japan will continue to do well. Now, in the case of Singapore, I know the perception is that Singapore has succeeded because of soft authoritarianism, to use your words. But at the same time, the ruling party of Singapore goes for elections every 5 years. These elections are not rigged. You can go and check the ballot boxes and so on and so forth. And in these elections, the people's vote counts in the end. And the ruling party has won the elections continuously for 60 years now, since 1965, when Singapore became independent. And it retains this support, not because the people are frightened and therefore vote for the government. It retains the support because it has delivered the fastest increase in the standard of living of any people anywhere in the world. And so the ruling party, by the way, doesn't get 95% of the vote or 99% of the vote. It struggles to get 60% of the vote. And so some years when they do well, they get 65. On some years when they do badly, they go below 60. So it's an indication that there is still a very strong part of the population that is supporting the opposition in Singapore. So it is not in that sense like what you might call a North Korea or something. I was present at the first APEC leaders meeting that took place in Blake Island, Seattle in 1993. And I would say APEC itself has not achieved very much in terms of economic cooperation, but APEC has helped to, preserve the American presence in the East Asian region. And of course, as you know, America's presence has been very positive in terms of helping the growth of East Asia. So anything that keeps the United States anchored in East Asia is good for the region. But I must emphasize that the Asians are very promiscuous when it comes to multilateral arrangements. So there are incredible number of cooperative agreements within East Asia. I mentioned RCEP, you have the CPP, TPP, and then I mentioned APEC as the East Asian Summit. There's the ASEAN Regional Forum. There are many fora in Asia. And of course, the Chinese have launched something called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and China has also launched the Belt and Road Forum. So Asia is full of multilateral initiatives. And I think it's good that Asia is full of multilateral initiatives, because these multilateral initiatives help to strengthen the peace and prosperity of Asia.